Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking all about training load and training load management in dancers. And this is a really important concept and ties in fairly closely to some of the ideas around periodization that I touched on in a previous episode. So if you haven't listened to the periodization episode, I highly suggest you go back and listen to that one as well, because these two ideas are fairly tightly linked to each other, and I'll also put a link to that episode in the show notes. But today we're really going to dive into load management, training load. What is training load? How do we think about load management? All sorts of concepts like that. And this is a really important concept in dance because dancers are traditionally exposed to very high training loads. And we see higher training loads than in a lot of other sports or athletic activities. So when we think about like a professional dancer, how much they're training in a week, most dancers in a company are dancing sort of a typical 40-hour work week, or often even more than that when we look at like performance season, because they oftentimes will have sort of company class in the morning, and then they'll have rehearsals throughout the like afternoon time. They might have a little bit of a break, and then they're on stage in the evening performing. So it's full on days and really high training loads. And in other professional sporting sort of realms, we don't see that as much. And some of this, like I said, ties back into that idea of periodization, because other athletes, when they are in a more competition sort of cycle, or if they have a game or something like that, they're often not also training on that same day. Or if they are, it's a really sort of like a lower intensity or a shorter duration training session. So their overall training loads tend to be a lot lower than dancers. And I mean, I think one of the reasons why training loads in dancers are high does come back to this idea of tradition, this idea of, okay, we still have to do company class every day. We're still going to have rehearsals. We're still going to perform on the same day that we're rehearsing and having company class. And that's kind of just the way it's always been done. And I don't know how many companies or how many teachers and directors and things like that have sat down and really looked at it and said, you know what? What if it made sense not to have rehearsals on the days where we're performing? What if we allow the schedule to change throughout the year or change throughout these training cycles? So a lot of that exposure to high training loads, like I said, I think comes down to tradition. And increasingly, we're seeing even more saturated training loads. And I see this especially in younger adolescent dancers and especially kind of competition dancers, where all of a sudden training loads are much higher than they were in previous years, or even back when I was dancing. And we were dancing a lot back when I was dancing. But now what we were doing back then is maybe like the baseline of where dancers are starting now. And then we see these increases above it. And so again, how much thought is being put into this? Or is it just this idea of we're just going to keep rehearsing and adding extra rehearsals and extra practices and extra classes on top to sort of continually try and strive for perfection and be better, but at what cost? Because have we actually considered what these overall training loads look at? And I think I've touched on this before, but what I often see when I work with dancers, we spend time kind of dissecting their training schedule and looking at like, okay, where are you? Do you have time for rest and recovery and things like that? And what I often see is their base schedule might be quite reasonable. So when you look at like what classes they're registered for and what their usual weekly training schedule is, might actually be fairly reasonable and fall within sort of realms of what we would recommend in terms of training loads. But then there's tons and tons of extra stuff that's getting piled on top of that. So it's these extra rehearsals, extra private lessons, maybe even extra opportunities to participate in master classes or conventions or things like that. And all of a sudden the training loads are significantly higher. And in a lot of cases, almost double what people actually think that they are doing. So if you are a dancer of any type, but especially like an adolescent dancer, a competitive dancer, or a parent of one of those dancers, I would encourage you to keep a bit of a log for a week or two, or, going into competition season, and sort of see where your dancers or where your hours are lying compared to what you think they are. So what your schedule kind of is in a typical week, and then how much extra is being piled on top of that. Because I think a lot of people are quite surprised when they actually sit down and kind of calculate what they're doing, just how much extra there is when they actually factor in those types of things. So just something to think about, and maybe a little exercise for you to go through if you're not quite sure where you lie with regards to kind of training loads. So why is it problematic if our training loads are sort of not managed well? Well, we know from research that poor load management is a major risk factor for injury. And this is not just in dancers, this is in athletes as well. And this poor load management can be overloading, and that's what we see most commonly in the dance world. So the training loads are too high, but we also run into programs with underloading, or if the training loads are too low. And this comes into play when we've had dancers who've maybe been out with an injury, or they've had a break. I mean, if they're lucky enough to have had, say, a summer break or something like that, and then we throw them back into the demands of dance and expect them to be at that same level, they will be underloaded or undertrained for what we are then demanding of them. And like I said, we commonly see this with dancers coming back from injury, that if they've been out or at a reduced capacity for a period of time as they're rehabbing from an injury, but then as soon as they get the all clear to sort of dance, say the injury is deemed healed or whatever, they'll often try and throw themselves back in, but the rest of their body is probably not at a place where it can meet the demands of going straight back into those kind of training demands or performance demands. So that poor load management being a risk factor is not just overloading, but can also be underloading. We see the underloading less commonly in dance. It's certainly overloading that is more problematic, but you need to be aware of both of those scenarios. We also know that rapid changes in training loads lead to higher rates of injury. And so we see this, again, people coming back after breaks. So for instance, we have the winter break. Depending on when you're listening to this podcast, it's going to drop just in kind of that winter break period where a lot of dancers are going to have a little bit of time off dance. And when we come back in January and get back into it, if we all of a sudden go from not dancing at all for a few weeks, which is probably a good thing. I'm not saying don't take that break. We need that break. But if we've had, say, 2 weeks off where we haven't danced at all, and all of a sudden we come back on day one and we're going straight back into that same training schedule that we were doing previously, that's a huge rapid change in training load on the body, and we see problems arise. So we'll see in the clinic spikes in sort of people coming in and spikes in injuries when we know there's been changes in training load. So it's often the first few weeks back after summer break or after winter break or spring break or times like that where there are these rapid changes in training loads. So it's not just the overall load management of over or under training, but it's also sudden changes in that training load that we need to keep in mind are going to put our dancers at higher risk for injuries. So I've been using the word training load and talking about it a lot, but I think it's important that I give you a bit of a definition about what specifically it is that we're referring to when we talk about load or training load. So training load is the accumulative amount of stress placed on an individual from a single or multiple training sessions over a defined period of time. And it can be structured or unstructured. So I realize that's a little bit of a mouthful of a definition. I will break that down just a little bit. So it's the cumulative amount of stress placed on an individual from a single or multiple training sessions over a defined period of time. So in dance, we're often looking at training loads over a day or a week or a month. And it can take into account structured or unstructured activity. So our structured activity would be like our actual classes and rehearsals and performances and things like that. And unstructured activity would be more things like dancers practicing on their own or, running their dances in open studio time or things like that. So when we look at kind of diving into that a little bit more, training load is a product of intensity times duration times frequency. So the intensity is how hard we're working, the duration is how long the training session is lasting for, and then the frequency is obviously how often that is happening. And I'm going to dive into this a little bit more in a minute because those concepts are important to understand when we want to talk about how we actually manage training load. So I'm going to come back to that in a second, but just remember that training load is a product of all three of those things, so intensity, duration, and frequency. When we discuss training load or when we are kind of talking about it or thinking about it, there's different ways of measuring it. And this is where training load becomes a little bit problematic in the dance world because we actually don't measure it very well, probably compared to, again, like if we compare it to other sports or other athletics. So it can be measured as an external load. And so there's various ways of doing that. And the easiest way of doing that is with time. And that's most commonly what we use in the dance world is we'll use time. So we'll say, often, and when dancers are coming into the clinic, one of my questions to them on an initial assessment is always, how many hours a week do you dance? Like, what is your schedule? So we use time because it's an easy way of quantifying training load. And it's one of those external measures of training load, but it's not maybe always the most accurate. And I'll speak to that a little bit more in a second. But there's other ways of measuring external training load. So in other sports, things like number of repetitions is used more often. So in baseball, like young baseball players have restrictions on how many pitches they can do in a practice session or in a game. And so they're using pitch count, which would be like number of repetitions. We'll use number of repetitions more if we're looking at like a weight training or strength training program, things like that. It can be measured in things like power output, as well. So there's all sorts of external measurements that we can use. But like I said, in the dance world, we tend to use time most frequently. We can also measure training load using internal load measurements. These are much, much harder to obtain a lot of the time, but in some cases may be more accurate. And so again, in some professional sports, you'll actually see athletes wearing trackers. So they'll have like trackers that are actually looking at some of the external load measurements, but also some of these more internal load measurements. So examples of internal load measurements might be things like heart rate variability, blood lactate levels, so things at a more physiological level. But it can also be things like perceived exertion. So that is a scale, it's a subjective scale where we can ask an athlete or ask a dancer, how hard are you working? So on a scale of say 1 to 10, or sometimes we use scales of 6 to 20, depending on like what scale you're using, we can say, how intense was that activity? How hard were you working? And somebody can give a subjective number. Okay, that was a 4 out of 10, or that was a 9 out of 10. And it gives us an idea of where we're at from the perspective of like a more internal load measurement. So I want to come back to this idea of time for a second, because like I said, it is probably what is most commonly used. If we are actually even thinking about training load in dancers, we are most commonly using time. And it's certainly better than no measurement or tracking at all, but it is highly variable when we look at it, because we can have a dancer who's training, I'm just going to pick a nice round number, but 20 hours per week. And we can have another dancer who is also training 20 hours per week, but their training loads could be very, very different because intensity is one of the things that makes up training load. And we all know as dancers that you'll sometimes have a class or a rehearsal or performance or whatever it is where we might actually not be working that hard. It might be a choreography session and maybe you're not in the main part of the choreography, or they're blocking another aspect of the choreography. And so there's maybe like a lot of standing around and you're maybe not actually physically exerting yourself a whole lot in that session. But then the next rehearsal after that, maybe you have a solo in that session. And so your intensity level is significantly higher. And so you can see how time alone is not necessarily a really great measurement of training load because the intensity can vary so drastically. So that's where things like that perceived exertion can come into play and can potentially be utilized a little bit more. And so there are ways of sort of tracking perceived exertion, and there's been some studies that are have been done and some that are sort of ongoing where they've actually looked at like getting dancers to like record daily, like what their actual exertion levels were in classes. And so it might be like, okay, I trained for 5 hours that day and 3 hours of that were at an 8 out of 10 intensity and 2 hours of that were at a 3 out of 10 intensity or things like that. So we can start to get a better picture of maybe how intense like that training load was, or looking at the intensity part of overall training load so that we're not just looking at the time aspect of it. There's also a little bit of research happening on a small scale right now, but hopefully we'll see more of this like sort of coming in what I was referring to earlier of some of these like wearable technology. So again, in other sports, they're being utilized all the time. If we look at professional soccer players or things like that, they wear these GPS trackers, and at the end of a game, it gives them loads of information. It tells them how far they ran in that game, what their heart rate was, what their max speed was, like how long they were in certain cardiovascular training zones, things like that. They can get a lot of really detailed information. And as of yet, that hasn't really transcended into the dance world, but there is some research happening in looking at, using some forms of technology, and especially the wearable technology that might give us a better idea of whether, if we're tracking, say, like heart rate variability, or even being able to use like GPS type technology to look at like how many impacts is a dancer doing in a training session, like how many jump landings or things like that, because that can give us an idea of training load as well. So I think this is an area that is exciting in how much potential there is in the future to be able to get much better and more accurate data around training load for dancers. But as it stands right now, for the most part, we don't really track this at all. So even using these measures like time or perceived exertion that are maybe not the absolute most accurate ways of tracking it, using those is still going to be better than nothing, because right now the status quo is that for the most part, we don't actually really track this at all in dancers and don't really take into consideration sort of what these training loads are. So like I said, not perfect measurements right now, but better than nothing. And I think we'll see improvements in this as we go forward. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, with managing training load in dancers, and especially in a studio setting, in a company setting, there's maybe a little bit more ability to manipulate some of these variables a little bit more. But in a studio setting, and, working a lot with like competitive dancers or working with dance teachers and studio owners who are in a more traditional like community studio setting, when we think about training load being that product of intensity, duration, and frequency are hard to manipulate. And that is because our schedules are kind of set. We have, the daily studio schedule, and we know that, grade 4 ballet is from 4 to 5, and then intermediate ballet is from 5 to 6, or whatever your schedule looks like. And we can't just really change that on the fly. There's too many logistics involved. Kids are registered for certain classes, for certain sessions. Teachers are there to teach on certain days, things like that. And so really, when we actually look at duration and frequency, that is often set in stone, sort of from the beginning of the year, let's say. And that's not to say that we can't look at this like on a bigger scale. And when studio owners especially are setting schedules for like the upcoming year, hopefully this is something that we like take into consideration and look at. And again, this is why it ties so closely into that concept of periodization. But once the schedule is set, we have kids that are registered for a certain number of hours per week. And so if you have a dancer who's registered to dance 8 hours per week or whatever it is, you can't just be like, oh, well, actually, we're only going to dance 5 hours this week because we want to decrease your training load, and therefore I'm just not going to teach you those 3 hours you're registered for. That's just logistically not going to happen because parents have paid for those classes. Parents are expecting their child to get instruction and all of that kind of stuff. So I realize that training load is harder to manage in like a studio setting like that versus a company setting where, the company directors and stuff, like the dancers are essentially employed full time and you can change their work schedule kind of however you want as long as you give them notice about it. And so that you could say, Tuesdays we're dancing this many hours, then on Wednesday it's going to be this many hours. Like it's much more fluid and easy to change because they're not expecting to get a certain amount of like instructional hours, and they're also not paying like directly for each of those hours, if that makes sense. There's obviously like labor laws and stuff that go into it, and some dance companies are unionized and things like that, and that's a whole different conversation. But when we're looking at this community dance sort of structure or more like competitive studios and things like that, it is much, much harder to manipulate duration and frequency. That being said, that duration and frequency is often the thing that gets added to. So if we're looking at like where we see overloading coming in, it's often because extra rehearsals, extra classes, extra privates are being added to a schedule. But if we want to look at decreasing dancers' loading, and specifically if it is like sort of that idea of like tapering or deloading, like prior to a performance or a competition or something, that becomes harder for us to do. So that really leaves us with intensity being the easiest variable to manipulate. And so if we know that we have to have our dancers at the studios for X number of hours a week, and they're going to be there that day, and they're going to have, 5 hours of class or whatever it is, if we are cognizant of their training loads and looking at kind of where their training loads have been at over like the previous, few weeks, or what they have coming up in terms of physical demands and things like that, we may look at that intensity and look at either intentionally increasing it if we think that they need to like progressively increase the intensity to be able to meet performance demands, or we may look at intentionally decreasing the intensity to allow a little bit more sort of recovery and management of that overall training load. And this is an area where I think a lot of teachers maybe instinctively sort of like know that dancers oftentimes need periods of like less intensity. Like you'll often hear teachers be like, oh, I need something to do with my class today that's like, they're still going to like learn something. It's still productive, but they need a bit of a break. Like I can't just do my regular tech class like I would normally do. And you'll see this, like there's like Facebook forums and stuff that I'm in. And these questions get asked all the time where teachers will be like, does anybody have any ideas of like games we can play or activities we can do just to like give the dancers a bit of a break? And so I'm going to throw out some ideas for you just to have some tangible things when you think like, do you know what? We really need to think about decreasing some of this like training load, and the intensity is the easiest way to do it. There's lots of things that we can be working on that are still productive, but are physically less demanding or at a physically decreased level of intensity. So one thing we could focus on would be like active recovery type things. And I talked about this more in the podcast on rest and recovery. So I'll link that one in the show notes as well if you haven't gone and listened to that. But active recovery might be things like participating in like a yoga class, or going for like a walk in the neighborhood, or things like that, where again, it's lower intensity, but they're still doing something, they're still moving. Maybe you take a class to do some like myofascial release, like everybody has a foam roller and some balls, and they work on some like myofascial release stuff in their body. So you could use it for kind of more active recovery type activities. If you're looking for ideas for decreased intensity, team building activities are always a fun one to add in. We know that teams that participate in more team building stuff have better team cohesion and perform better. So especially if it's kind of like the beginning of competition season and you want your team to kind of bond a little bit more, you could look at some team building activities. So they might not be directly dance related activities, but that still kind of serves our overall purpose of creating like team cohesion, and we know they'll perform better if we have more of that. We can use classes to dive into things like dance history, or like deepen their knowledge of dance. Like maybe we want to look at, if say it's a jazz class, maybe you want to look at like the history of jazz and where it came from, and different styles and genres of jazz, and like where those lineages come from, and dance pedagogy, and all of those types of things that oftentimes we don't have time to like give that part of dance education to our dancers. There's so much focus on just like drilling routines and getting technique and working on triple pirouettes and whatever it is. But those histories of dance and where dance comes from and like where it's rooted in and all of that kind of stuff is really important for dancers to kind of understand. We could use that time to work on artistry in our dancers. Again, I feel like when intensity gets high, it becomes very like kind of like the physical side of dance. And it's very much like, okay, we want legs to be higher, jumps to be higher, turns to be sharper, cleaner, whatever it is. But like, when do we have time to work on some of the more artistic sides of things? So maybe we spend that time really working on like musicality, or we really work on like lines of arms and things like that, where we're still doing dance type activities and even like potentially running their dances, but only doing it with an eye for like the artistic side of things. So one of my favorite activities is getting dancers to either like stand on a spot, or sometimes I'll do it with them like sitting on a yoga ball or something, and do their whole dance through like to the music, but only using arms and heads. So they don't have the actual like movement to be able to express the, quality or whatever. And it really forces them to think about, okay, like how do I, emote or like get the artistic side of this across with like just arms and heads. And that automatically is going to be less physical intensity than running a dance full out, doing all of the moves. You could use it as a time to bring in people to do education sessions with your dancers. So potentially bringing in like somebody to talk about injury prevention or mental skills training or dance nutrition. There's so many topics. And again, there's often like kind of a bit of like a perceived lack of time to accomplish these things, but we can really strategically put them in times throughout the year in the schedule where we want like a decrease in intensity in our dancers' training schedule. Maybe that's a really great time to bring in a guest speaker and do a workshop that's a little bit more just like knowledge-based and not so much like a movement-based workshop. And then one of the other things that I think a lot of studios struggle with is finding time for costuming. It takes ages. Every teacher knows that, measurements and trying on costumes and alterations and all of that can be really time consuming, and even just picking costumes for dances and things like that. And again, if we have a training block where we know that we want the intensity to be slightly less for our dancers, maybe that's a really good time to take part of a class or, part of like one day sessions to actually set time aside for those types of things where, again, physically they're not going to be doing a whole lot, but it's all important in terms of like the overall package of dance and where that finished product comes from. So those are just a few ideas of things that we can think about when we're trying to like decrease the intensity, because like I said, we don't have as much control over duration or frequency when we have our dancers in sort of like a registered program where we know that they're showing up for class that day at 4:00 or whatever time they're arriving at the studio. So those are ideas of things that you can think about that are going to be a really productive use of your time and a productive use of your dancers' time, but not necessarily going to be as physically intensive in sort of what you're asking your dancers to do. So a way of looking at kind of decreasing the overall sort of training load. So I'm just looking at the time and I'm going to wrap things up there. One of the questions that I often get asked from parents or teachers or dancers is sort of like, what are the recommendations for training loads if we're thinking about time? So again, going back to this like hours per week of like how much should dancers be dancing? And there is not great research to answer that question, but there's some kind of what we would consider like professional consensus. So people who work within the field, and so based on just like our experience within the field, and then taking some of the research from other sports and activities and like physical literacy research and things like that, there are some general guidelines that have been sort of laid out. I'm not going to talk you through all of them here just because, again, I'm cognizant of the time. But there is a download on my website. I will link that in the show notes as well if you're interested in looking at what those recommendations are. And they're broken down by age. So we look at kids like under the age of 10, kids kind of like from around 10 or 11 until they go through their adolescent growth spurt, and then kind of dancers after that age. So those recommendations are available. I will just caveat that by saying it's going to be highly variable with individuals. So those are very much general guidelines, and some dancers are 100% fine dancing within those guidelines. Other dancers, it might be too much for them, and some dancers, it might be too little. So it's not like a hard and fast rule, but especially if you're a teacher and you're trying to think like, okay, what is a reasonable expectation of like what my dancer should be doing. And especially, so these guidelines are like designed for competitive dancers. So dancers who are dancing sort of more hours than maybe just your recreational dancer. It gives you a rough outline of those. So like I said, I will link that in the show notes if you want more information about kind of concrete guidelines of what dancers sort of should be aiming for, should not be going above, is really like what that comes down to. And I will wrap things up there. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you found that helpful with regards to how we think about loading and load management in dancers. As always, I welcome any and all feedback. Please reach out, send me a DM, send me an email. I love hearing from all of you guys. And I would really appreciate it if you wanted to leave a review or leave a ranking for the podcast on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. And if you found this helpful and think that there is another dancer or teacher in your life who would also find this helpful, please feel free to share it with them. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day.